Alright guys, so I got a bunch of different Israel updates that I just want to pack into one video here. We're going to start off with some absolutely infuriating State Department press briefings. We're also going to look at a highly questionable State Department report that just recently came out, and also the Congress funding bill that just passed through that is essentially codifying the cuts to the UNRWA as a massive famine is looming on the horizon in Gaza. We're going to look at a war crime that was caught on camera in broad daylight. And then we're going to finish off with some interesting polling in terms of how the American people feel about Biden's handling of all of this so far. So let's go ahead and start off here with this little demon boy, this ghoul here, Matthew Miller, who's being questioned by the journalist Matt Lee on what exactly the recent UN ceasefire resolution that the U.S. allowed to pass means moving forward. Is it meaningful? Is this going to change U.S. policy? Well, let's go ahead and hear what he has to say.
Okay, but the abstention means that you're okay with it. You're willing to go along with it, and so what do you expect now to happen as a result of the passage of this resolution?
So I think.
Do you expect that Israel is going to announce a ceasefire?
I do not.
Do you expect that Hamas is going to release hostages?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that we have objected to for some time is that most of the people that call for a ceasefire, we believe, are calling for Israel to unilaterally stop operations and not calling for Hamas to agree to a ceasefire where they would release hostages.
Well, I think it goes both ways, doesn't it?
It could, but but the resolution today is a non-binding resolution. But
okay, so what's the point? Well, why did you abstain? Why didn't you veto?
We didn't veto because we thought the language in it was consistent with something that the language as it relates to the ceasefire and release of hostages was consistent with the long-standing United States position.
So you don't believe anything is going to happen as a result of the passage of this resolution?
So I think that separate and apart from this resolution, we have active, ongoing negotiations to try to achieve what this resolution calls for, which is an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. I can't say that this resolution is going to have any impact on those negotiations. But those negotiations are ongoing. They've been ongoing over the weekend, and they've made progress.
So I don't expect you to answer this now, but to me, just stick this in your pocket. If that's the case, what the hell is the point of the UN? Or the UN Security Council?
So we think it plays an important role.
It does, even though its action does absolutely nothing. And that you're going to get what you would like to see, not out of the UN, but out of discussions in Doha.
So we believe it's important that the UN speak and the UN Security Council speak on matters of international security. It's why we've been engaged in this process, why we thought we were going to have a successful vote on Friday that Russia and China unfortunately and quite cynically vetoed. But I do believe that ultimately if we were able to achieve a ceasefire and the release of hostages is going to come not through a UN process, but through the process.
Okay, so great question there, right? From Matt Lee. And you can kind of tell with guys like him and guys like Saeed and other ones, even like Ryan Grimm, for example, a lot of these guys who have been doing this for years, they've been around through multiple administrations, Republicans, Democrats alike, and they know the bullshit tactics that guys like Matthew Miller are going to use. And so they have this tendency to just not accept what they say at face value and to ask some of the most fundamental, basic follow-up questions. And that's exactly what he's doing here. So shout out to Matt Lee in this instance. Now, in terms of the substance of what Matthew Miller is saying there, I mean, it's exactly what Matt Lee was just pointing out. What the hell is the point of having a United Nations or having any sort of body for international law if the most powerful countries in the world, whether it's the United States or even Russia or China, if these countries can just ignore whatever the UNSC has to say about this? I mean, that's effectively what he's admitting here. There is no point. Might makes right. We can do whatever the hell we want. The UN doesn't have a military, so you can't come stop us. That's basically what this boils down to, right? And so in terms of the negotiations that are being led by the United States, maybe at some point this does result in some sort of a temporary ceasefire. That's possible. I don't know how this is going to play out. I can't predict the future. But it's important to understand the language of the different resolutions that were put forward. And I did a whole breakdown on both of the different resolutions over the last week. And it's kind of revealing that he says that this most recent one is actually somehow perfectly in line with the U.S.-led negotiations for a ceasefire, even though they just days before that voted against, or weeks before that voted against similar ceasefire proposals, right? So they put forward a ceasefire proposal that was trying to connect Hamas has to release the hostages in order for there to be a ceasefire. This is also part of the negotiations that they've been leading, right? And they've come out and talked about this. Biden has, Kamala has, how basically they want Hamas to give up the hostages. There will be some sort of a short temporary ceasefire, okay? And then after that, maybe Israel continues with the offensive, right? This is what they've been openly discussing. What the more recent resolution says is that these two things are not inherently connected. Yes, Hamas should release the hostages, and there needs to be an immediate ceasefire, but one of those is not dependent on the other. And that's what the United States has been trying to push forward with, which is something that I think they know Hamas is very unlikely to agree to, right? If you're negotiating between two partners, and one partner says to the other, give up all of your leverage, in this case the hostages, and then in a couple weeks' time we're going to continue with our mission to completely eradicate you and continue a genocide, not exactly, a good way to come to the negotiating table, okay? At least not in my opinion. But here again, you have the United States just admitting that this ceasefire resolution, even though the U.S. let it pass, they abstained from the vote, they didn't block it this time, it's not actually going to come into play because they are not willing to change U.S. policy in regards to Israel. That's the only way that this actually ends up stopping, is if the United States applies the leverage that we have over Israel and forces them to change the direction. That's it. That's the only way that this happens. Okay? Now again, it's somewhat of a half step in the right direction that they allowed that resolution to pass. But if you got guys like Matthew Miller and Kirby coming out and saying shit like this, then what does it actually mean at the end of the day? I mean, here's John Kirby, who said, "We're kind of perplexed after Netanyahu canceled one of these trips to visit the U.S. He says, it's a non-binding resolution. There's no impact at all on Israel to continue to go after Hamas. As I said, it doesn't represent a change at all in our policy." So first off, these UN resolutions are binding. They are legally binding. I don't know if they're just like completely pulling this out of their ass or changing the definition of what the word binding means. But yes, for all intents and purposes, these are supposed to be legally binding resolutions, okay? You don't just get to come out and say they're not, and then they're not. I mean, you can ignore them, sure. But, you are actively complicit in what even the ICJ found to be a plausible genocide. That's what you guys are doing. And so you have John Kirby coming out here and basically like apologizing to Netanyahu for slightly hurting his feelings because the U.S. not even voted in favor of, but allowed a ceasefire resolution to pass. A resolution that was even watered down from what many other countries actually wanted to see, right? And I mean, you even had Matthew Miller in this first clip talking about, well, I think that most people just want Israel to completely unilaterally disengage from Gaza, right? That's what they mean when they're calling for a ceasefire. I mean, first off, two different things. When I say I want a ceasefire, yes, the priority, and I think most people would agree with this, the priority is to stop the onslaught against civilians in Gaza. That's step number one, right? If that can be paired with the hostages, especially, the non-militant hostages that Hamas has in their captivity in Gaza, if that can be paired with their release back to Israel, then that's fantastic. That's great. I want to see those hostages be able to go home to their families, right? Obviously. But if you're going to ask me to make a choice between the two in terms of which one takes priority, guys, there's over 100 people a day who are dying in Gaza, who are being killed in Gaza. Many people who are starving to death in Gaza right now. There's about 130 or so Israeli captives that are still inside Gaza. Some of them are under Hamas captivity. Some of them are, under the captivity of other groups. But about 130 who are being held hostage versus over 100 people who are being killed every single day. And as mass famine is on the immediate horizon, it seems like maybe that should be the most urgent thing that we're talking about here, right? But they just have this completely warped perspective on this. Now, there was another thing here where the same guy, Matthew Miller, he came out and he was pressed on UNRWA convoys that are no longer allowed by Israel amid the U.S. famine bill, making it illegal to fund the agency. He said, the question was, is it still the U.S. assessment that Israel is not using food or assistance as a weapon of war, which they absolutely are, and many Israeli politicians and officials have openly come out and said that. But he says, we have not made an assessment or drawn a conclusion that they are in violation of international law. Okay, and this was backed up by this State Department report that just dropped. Okay, so this is tying in with that recent demand from Biden like a month ago or so, where he said, we need a written assurance from Israel that they are not violating international law. And if you pinky promise us that you're following international law, we're fine. We're going to continue on the same trajectory and nothing will have to change, right? I mean, it's a bullshit tactic here. It's just virtue signaling to pretend as if he cares whether or not they're following international law. No, he doesn't. If you did care, then you would just look at the fucking evidence. I mean, the mountains and mountains of evidence that we have of on camera, Israeli IDF war crimes that are being committed on a daily basis. This is no secret. The idea that Israel isn't blocking humanitarian aid is utterly ridiculous at this point. You have to completely disbelieve the entirety of every single major human rights organization around the world, of the United Nations and all of the various reports that they've recently put out. You would have to ignore statements from Israeli ministers and officials and, military members who have come out and admitted that they're trying to halt the aid from getting into Gaza. You'd also have to disbelieve your own government, the US government, because why the fuck is the United States going and building a temporary port off the coast of Gaza to get aid into Gaza if Israel isn't blocking it? Why do you need to do that? Believe it or not, there are tons of different land crossings that Israel could be allowing aid to get through. They're not. That's why you're proposing this stupid port idea. I mean, it's like they gaslight us over and over and over again and expect that people can't connect these very simple dots together, right? I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. No evidence that Israel is violating laws with U.S. weapons. No evidence. Let's close our eyes, put our head in the sand, and just ignore everything, right? This is the same State Department, right, whose representatives were coming out and saying that the ICJ case of violating the Genocide Convention against Israel was meritless and counterproductive, right? Oh, I'm shocked that they found that they're not violating international law. I mean, Jesus Christ, man. I mean, some interesting things from this piece. Here was another Matthew Miller quote. "We've had an ongoing assessment of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law. We have not found them to be in violation, either when it comes to the conduct of the war or the provision of humanitarian assistance. We view those assurances that Israel gave them that through ongoing that work that we have done." I mean, the Biden administration will now have 90 days to provide Congress with a report on whether the Israeli government has abided by its assurances. I mean, what are we looking at here, guys? What is the meaning of any of this? What is the point of doing reports like this? It's nonsense. I mean, this is the same government that Anthony Blinken, just a week ago, on the 19th of March, he said 100% of the population of Gaza is experiencing severe levels of acute food insecurity. He went on to say that this is the first time in history, in documented history, that the entire population of any given group of people is under this categorization. So how do you, on the one hand, say 100% of the population is starving, and then on the other hand say, but Israel isn't blocking the aid from getting in? I mean, it's just like the cognitive dissonance is infuriating. It's going to make my fucking head explode. I'm going to have a stroke from this. Now, we move on to this, because at the same time that the Biden administration is saying 100% of the population is starving, we also have this. The U.S. Congress just passed a bill. Cuts funding to UNRWA, sends another $3.8 billion to Israel. So it's not the $14 billion that we were expecting, but $3.8 billion basically just as a reaffirmation. Hey guys, we still like you. We're still friends, right? $3.8 billion. And it also limits aid to the Palestinian Authority if the Palestinians initiate or support an international criminal court investigation against Israel for human rights crimes. Think about that, guys. This is what our Congress just passed into law. Right? Of course, they've had other laws that they've passed that were ridiculous, right? Remember the one that was basically just a bill to say Israel is not racist. Israel is not an apartheid state, right? So we had that law. But then you have laws like this where it's like, again, how on the one hand do you say, oh, there's no evidence that Israel's violating international law with our weapons, and then turn around and you say, but if you try to investigate them for violating international law, we are going to cut aid to you. We are going to put a stranglehold on you, more so than we already are right now. We're going to starve you, okay, if you dare to question anything that Israel does, or take them to international bodies that are supposed to be able to litigate these kinds of things. Limits aid to the PA if they initiate or support an ICC investigation into Israel human rights abuses. So here are the votes that were against that, just to give some credit to some of the members of the House. These are the only Democrats who who voted against this bill. He says here, Prem Thacker, that Ayanna Pressley was sick and submitted her vote after, so this number increased. But, some of these are very predictable names, right? Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar and AOC and Summer Lee and Barbara Lee and Ro Khanna and Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman and many others as well. So, credit to the ones who voted against this. In the Senate, it was somehow even worse than that abysmally low 23 members voting against it. Here in the Senate, we had only 2 nominally Democratic affiliated members of the Senate who voted against this. We had Michael Bennet and Bernard Sanders. Okay, so I guess shout out to Bernie for being the only real Democrat to vote against this for the right reasons. Michael Bennet didn't vote against this bill because of its cuts to UNRWA. He voted against the bill because he didn't think it had enough Ukraine aid within it. So very different reasons for voting against this. But everybody else, every other Democrat voted in favor of this. Every single one of them. It is just... It's an endorsement of famine. That's what this is. This is the United States government staring a famine that is being caused by the government that we are giving diplomatic cover to, that we are giving financial aid to, that we are giving weapons to, and is in the midst of committing a genocide. Okay, we're looking at that, and we're saying, yeah, there's a famine on the horizon. 100% of the population is severely food insecure, and we're just going to cut the aid to UNRWA. Based on what? Based on what? Reminder. Okay, even the EU and I believe Canada and several other countries that initially cut their funding to UNRWA, they've now resumed funding to UNRWA. Why? Because Israel never provided any substantiated evidence for their claims that 12 out of 13,000 UNRWA members had some affiliation with the October 7th Hamas attack inside of Israel. They never provided evidence. And the US is still like the lone country out here leading the charge. Just say, we don't care. They don't have to provide evidence. We're just going to take whatever they said the first day at face value and just stick with that until I guess like the negative is proven, right? They're saying these Palestinians are guilty until proven innocent, until some investigation is done to figure out whether 0.04% of UNRWA had an affiliation with October 7th. Until then, and you guys prove yourselves innocent, we're going to hold 2 million Palestinians hostage in Gaza as they're starving to death. That's what the U.S. government is saying right now. So now we move on to this. One of the recent many violations of international law that we have seen from Israel. I see these across my timeline every single day. I could bring you guys a new one every day, but it's honestly overwhelming to see this over and over and over again while nothing is being done about it, and the U.S. government continues to try to gaslight people to pretend like this kind of shit is not happening. And so, warning, this is, somewhat graphic. I believe Al Jazeera blurred this out a little bit, but here you see a couple of civilians, totally unarmed, just walking down the street. And these are apparently kids as well. And you see these people walking down the street, and then a drone circles around and directly strikes them. Okay, so let's go ahead and play a little bit of this. So you can see them walking down the street, obviously unarmed, nothing suspicious about them, surrounded by rubble. Jesus, you can even see the utter destruction that's surrounding them on these streets, and the tank marks and everything from the IDF that's been in the area. And then poof, just like that, just vaporized 4 people. Okay, and you can see multiple strikes that hit there. Now, if we fast forward here a little bit, there was another situation where I believe this was one of the guys who was trying to walk away. And even so, in this first instance, to me, you can't even make an argument that this was not intentional, that this is not just a brazen war crime that was caught on camera by the drone itself. But then, even if you don't believe that, and you say, oh, well, they looked suspicious, or maybe there was some confusion or justification, well, here you have another guy, okay, same situation, he's trying to walk away, he's an isolated individual, does he look armed, does he look like he's about to attack some IDF soldier, he looks like he's maybe carrying a t-shirt or something, and then they strike him. So they did a double tap, right? They struck the first group, and then circle back around to fire on this individual. Another one, because that's not even it. This guy, stumbling, clearly injured, disoriented, crawling on his hands and knees, struck again. So, this went mega viral over the last couple of days. I think that this may have been the first time that many people saw this kind of thing happening. Again, I've seen it happen basically every day for the last 6 months straight, and many other young people have as well, which gives us an indication in terms of some of this polling data that I'm going to get to here. But when this is what people are seeing on a daily basis, and then the U.S. government turns around and says there's no evidence that Israel is using the weapons we're giving them, like these ones, to violate international law or to violate human rights laws. And as we're watching children literally die from starvation, and the U.S. government says, no, they're not blockading the aid, they're not violating any international laws, what does that do in the minds of especially young people who are seeing more of this on social media and everything? What does that do to the minds of people in terms of their respect or how much they trust the U.S. government moving forward? I mean, obviously, the U.S. government destroyed its credibility a long time ago for many different reasons. But I mean, there are lots of people who I know who, aren't necessarily the biggest, political people. And they certainly didn't have any, well thought out position on Israel and Palestine before all of this. But when you see this on such a repeated, relentless basis, this turns you not only against the Israeli government, but also against the U.S. government for supporting this, for arming this, and then fucking trying to gaslight you. Okay? So, I mean, this is going to have long-lasting consequences for people in my generation specifically. But some interesting polling data that recently came out from Pew here. So I'll link this down below if you want to go read the entire report. There was a ton of different interesting data here. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. So here from Tyson Brody, who kind of broke down the whole thing in this thread. He says this one is pretty interesting. Dem, I think is what he meant to say, / lean Dem is slightly more likely to say that Biden favors Israel too much. The fact striking the right balance isn't bigger and not sure that large feels like a sign that he's losing his base on this, right? So, I mean, you can see it here. Americans are divided over whether Biden is striking the right balance on the Israel-Hamas war. The overall here, 22%, saying that he's favoring Israelis too much. 21% striking the right balance. 16% favoring Palestinians too much, and 40% not sure. But, I mean, here you have more people saying he's favoring Israel too much. In the overall, this is the entirety of the American people here, and more say he's favoring Israel too much than even striking the right balance. Okay, and obviously you can look at the age breakdowns. It's younger people who are more so to be skeptical of Israel, and you can break it down as it goes by age. It's older people who are much less skeptical of Israel. Democrats tend to be more skeptical of Israel, and skeptical of Biden's policy in handling this. And the rest of that is kind of interesting, I guess. This one was interesting as well with Catholics and white Protestant, not evangelicals, having roughly either greater or the same amount saying that he's favoring Israel too much versus Jewish Americans, 13% saying he's favoring too much. But there's some more interesting data as we go down here. This one was kind of funny. I don't think I've ever seen a poll that is this evenly split amongst U.S. adults. So Americans are split on whether to provide Israel with military aid. So strongly favor 17%, somewhat favor 19%, neither favor nor oppose 14%, somewhat oppose 16%, and strongly oppose 19%, and then not sure 15%. Every single one of these numbers is either 14% or greater or 19% or lower. I've never seen a split like that in basically any poll in my entire life. But it seems like it's pretty evenly split here between oppose versus in favor, and then of course you have the not sure. Some other interesting things. These are the last two that I'm gonna focus in on here. So this one is on. This was the most revealing one to me. In the U.S., awareness that more Palestinians than Israelis have died is related to opinions about the current conflict. So, in the U.S., awareness that more Palestinians than Israelis have died is related... Oh, that's the same exact thing. Why did they just put that twice? Whatever. So, percentage who say that Joe Biden is favoring Israelis too much, striking the right balance, or favoring Palestinians too much, or not sure. So, this first bar is among those who are aware that more Palestinians have died. Okay, now I want to point out here, guys, 50% almost, it was like 48, 50% of Americans, according to this recent polling that just came out, are not aware that more Palestinians have died than Israelis. I mean, think about that. Think about what that says about the utter abysmal failure of the US media. It's not just that more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. It's like 30 times the number. So the idea that half the country almost doesn't know if Israelis or Palestinians have been killed more or to a higher degree, that blew my mind, guys. I mean, I guess it really shouldn't, maybe, if you only watch mainstream media or if you're not really tracking the news at all, but you can see the implications of that here. Because among those who are aware that more Palestinians have died, 35% say that they're favoring the Israelis too much. Among those who are not aware, it drops down to 9% who are saying they are favoring Israelis too much. Again, the number on striking the right balance. If you know that Palestinians are being massacred and significantly more have been killed than Israelis, 25% say striking the right balance, versus if you're not aware, it drops down to 16%. Favoring Palestinians too much, I don't know. There's some 15%, 17% that say that Biden is somehow favoring Palestinians too much, which is just utterly deranged at this point. And then this one, 59%, a huge chunk of it, a majority of the people who are not aware that more Palestinians have died are unsure about it. So I guess they're just kind of lost and not really tracking what's going on. But again, the lesson here is that the media has done an abject failure in terms of educating the American people on what is actually happening, what Israel is doing, what the United States government is supporting. And then the takeaway is that the more people get exposed to real information about what Israel is doing on the ground in Gaza to innocent civilians, the more likely they are to be opposed to giving further aid to the Israelis, to be critical of Israel and their government and of Joe Biden for supporting this genocide. I mean, this is part of the reason, not to, make it too blunt of a point, but this is part of the reason why the U.S. government is trying to ban TikTok. We've seen so many different politicians who have openly come out and admitted, yeah, we think that kids are being radicalized against Israel on TikTok. And it's no, it's not kids or young people are being radicalized. Maybe they are to some extent, but not in the sense that you're using the term. They're being radicalized because they're seeing videos like the one I just showed you of brazen war crimes on a daily basis, of mothers, of children, of innocent civilians being massacred every single day for 6 months straight. That is going to have a lasting impact. It's not about anti-Semitism, okay? It's not about misinformation. It is about the more likely that you have a real understanding of what's happening on the ground, the more likely you are to be critical of Israel. That's it. That's how it works out. So there's a massive information gap here. They also say percent who say that the U.S. is providing humanitarian aid to help Palestinians in Gaza is good. So among those who are aware that more Palestinians have died than Israelis, only 16% oppose sending more humanitarian aid. 69% in favor. And then if you're not aware of that fact, then those in favor drops down to 29%. So, I mean, this shit has a lasting impact, guys. I mean, this is part of why I even do this channel, why I even make videos on a daily basis for you guys, is hopefully to try to get some of that information that doesn't make it into Chuck Todd's show, or doesn't make it into Anderson Cooper's show, or Sean Hannity's show, or whatever, to give you guys some more of a perspective in terms of what is actually going on. How can we parse through the bullshit talking points? And so, I mean, Jesus Christ, that data is really it's mind-blowing when you think about it. Half of the United States doesn't know that more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. I mean, I've spent the last 6 months straight talking about this. And even before then, you can look at historic comparisons through recent back and forths, right? And it's always Palestinians who are killed at a much larger scale than Israelis. And then you got, guys like Matthew Miller and John Kirby coming out and insisting, no, they're not in violation of international law. State Department comes out with a report. Don't worry, guys. Israel pinky promised us behind the scenes that they're not breaking any laws, so we believe them. We're going to continue supporting them and funding them and arming them. And by the way, the United Nations doesn't mean shit. We're going to do whatever we want. They're not going to have an impact on our policy in any way, shape, and form. We're above the law. And also, we're going to pass bills through Congress that worsen the humanitarian situation on the ground. So, I mean, it really is just completely disgusting.